We're looking at the first generation in American history to have a shorter lifespan than their parents. On this episode of Designing Healthy Communities, I'm going to examine the connection between our current obesity-triggered type 2 diabetes epidemic and suburban sprawl.
Diabetes, not a good thing to fool around with. I went in for some treatment. They said I was going to take my foot off.
In epidemiology, we call it a common source epidemic. When everyone begins to develop the same set of symptoms, it's not something in their mind, it's something in our environment that is changing our health. We will see communities that are combating the causes of type 2 diabetes, not through medication and amputation, but by redesigning our car-centric society. The time has come for the retrofitting of suburbia. Join me on a quest to combat chronic disease with smart design by retrofitting suburbia.
Major funding provided by the Kresge Foundation, seeking to influence the quality of life for future generations through support of the arts, community development, Detroit, education, the environment, health, and human services. The California Endowment challenges the conventional wisdom that health happens solely in the doctor's office. We believe that health happens here, in neighborhoods, in schools, and with prevention. W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a partner with communities where children come first.
Architects committed to improving where we live by helping make communities safe and healthy through the power of design.
Marisla Foundation. Kaiser Permanente, building healthier communities. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for Healthier Lives. Additional funding by a Syracuse consortium of funders, joined together for a healthy community.
A pediatrician and former center director at the CDC, co-author of Making Healthy Places, Designing and Building for Health, Well-Being, and Sustainability, Dr. Richard Jackson believes that building America for the needs of cars, not people, is a major contributor to our nation's epidemic of type 2 diabetes.
I worked for 30 years doing epidemic investigations and looking at chemical effects on people, air pollution, a whole series of issues. And about 10 years ago, while I was at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, I became really engrossed, almost obsessed with the fact that we have built America in a way that is, I believe, fundamentally unhealthy, that it prevents us from walking. It inhibits us from socializing. It removes trees and the things that make our air quality better. And we could not have designed an environment that is more difficult for people's well-being at this point, particularly as we look at epidemics of obesity, diabetes. When you become overweight, it greatly increases your risk of becoming diabetic. And as we went around the country, we saw people coping with the very difficult challenges of diabetes. We saw a man that was going to lose his foot because of the disease diabetes.
As the wound got bigger, it got sore. I went in for some treatment. They said I was going to take my foot off. Well, it shocked me, and after the doctor told me and walked away, I got a little emotional. I cried a little bit. I'm thinking about doing that right now.
Don't want to get to the point where someone's saying we're going to have to cut your foot off. We'll come back to Ray, but first let's put his potential tragedy, and that of millions of Americans like him, in perspective. Diabetes alone, which has doubled in the last 15 years, is costing 2% of the entire gross domestic product of the United States. Think about all the money we spend in the United States, having 2% of it just for diabetes, and it was 1%, now it's 2% because we've doubled it. This is a crushing economic impact. And if we really begin to think about the costs of these, the interventions we put in place, whether it's healthy food or more exercise or more education, it's cheap by comparison to what? Treating a diabetic with gangrene of the feet. Like many Americans, Ray spends much of his life behind the wheel of an automobile with little opportunity to walk or exercise. No time to cook, it's easier and cheaper to get most of his meals through the drive-through window.
I live by myself, so I don't take care of myself as well as I should. I eat out a lot, or I eat fast foods.
We need to make fruits and vegetables and things that are healthy for us as cheap as we make junk food right now, because junk food is a real bargain. You get a lot of calories for not very much money, but it's a long-term disaster for people's health. One of the epidemics we're looking at is the epidemic of obesity. And if you're obese, it greatly increases your risk of becoming diabetic. We have added 25 pounds to the body of virtually every single American adult. 14 pounds to a 14-year-old child, about 11 pounds to an 11-year-old child. When I was a young pediatrician, we never saw a child with adult onset diabetes. We now don't call it that. We call it type 2 diabetes. And my endocrinology friends are telling me half the children in the pediatric diabetic clinic have type 2 diabetes, so-called adult onset diabetes. And the doctors are telling me that they're seeing diseases, heart failure, liver problems, joint problems, that they see in 50, 60, 70-year-olds, in teenagers because of this obesity epidemic.
People are going to get sicker, and people are going to be taken care of much earlier in their life.
We're seeing more of these problems in young children now. It used to be a problem of adulthood, and we're seeing this in children, 11, 12 years old, which was not a problem we were seeing maybe 15, 20 years ago.
I think we are looking at the first generation in American history to live less long than their parents. This is shocking.
We regularly intervene at 4 years old, 3 years old. She is between the 90th and 95th percentile, which means she's in the overweight category. With young people that I work with, the population that were obese are now heading towards morbid obesity. And also I'm seeing a lot of children, whether they're obese, overweight, or normal weight, as being not physically fit. 3/4 of the kids in California cannot pass a simple fitness test at this point. And it's because we've engineered walking, bicycling, and exercise out of their lives, and they're too overweight.
It's very difficult nowadays. There aren't a lot of places where kids can go to exercise. When we were little, we used to go out and run around the parks and around our community. Here it's difficult because of just safety nowadays.
A person who becomes diabetic before age 35 is looking at a 15-year reduction in their lifespan and about a 20-year reduction in their quality of life. Your quality of life, if you're getting dialysis and you have gangrene, is obviously going to be very bad. And so we think about environmental justice, but I think we need to think seriously about generational justice, because what we're doing is unjust to the generations that are following us if we let this continue.
As a physician, I am aware of the problems that are awaiting these children as they get into adulthood. And that's heartbreaking, because something like diabetes, coronary artery disease are lifelong illnesses once you have them. There's not really a cure for it.
Heartbreaking. Seeing a generation of potential Rays.
Well, diabetes snuck up on my foot and shut down the circulation in my foot, and I ended up getting a hole on the top of my foot. In the beginning, it was very painful. It was extremely sore in the beginning. As the wound got bigger, it got sore. I went in for some treatment. They said I was going to take my foot off. Well, it shocked me, and after the doctor told me and walked away, I got a little emotional. I cried a little bit. I'm thinking about doing that right now.
People can actually develop gangrene of the feet. One of the critical things for someone with diabetes is foot care. And what's happened with Ray is his diabetes has not been controlled, and he's now developing this ulcer, which could go on to causing him to lose his foot.
I sucked it up, got a second opinion, and let me tell you, a second opinion was good because I'm here, and they've taken good care of me.
Ray's doctors chose hyperbaric oxygen therapy in an attempt to save his foot. The oxygen therapy is worth trying. If someone said I was going to lose my foot, I'd certainly be trying hyperbaric, high-pressure oxygen therapy. But it takes a lot of time, it's expensive, it's not yet proven to absolutely work, but I can understand why anyone would want to try anything they can to keep from losing a foot.
I'm just hoping that it heals good so I can get a shoe back on it and go back to a normal life. Yeah, and diabetes, not a good thing to fool around with.
Well, Ray's foot may be saved, 78,000 amputations caused by diabetes occurred last year. More than 200,000 people had end-stage kidney disease, and more than 5 million had vision loss. And more than 25 million children and adults have diabetes. 79 million of us are pre-diabetic. The annual cost of diabetes is nearly $200 billion, an amount that equals 2% of our nation's GNP. We can prevent much of this loss and reduce the skyrocketing costs. Ray is right. Diabetes is nothing to fool around with. There are hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of Rays out there. If we really want to do something for their health, we've got to change their environments. And you don't want to get to the point where someone's saying we're going to have to cut your foot off. How we're building America is not good for our health. We've doubled diabetes in 15 years. When you see such a massive number of people confronting this, in epidemiology we call it a common source epidemic. When everyone begins to develop the same set of symptoms, it's not something in their mind, it's something in our environment that is changing our health. The purpose of our series is to combat deadly epidemics like diabetes and to help the millions of Rays in our nation, not by amputating limbs, but by understanding and mitigating the upstream causes that I believe are linked to poor design decisions, the worst of which is the creation of car-dependent sprawl. For thousands of years, cities were not healthy places to live for a whole litany of reasons, including poor sanitation and overcrowding that led to disease and epidemics, toxic industries spewing noxious waste near residential neighborhoods, killer fog and smog created by coal smoke, and massive fires that destroyed entire urban areas. For the poor and middle class, there was no escape from urban misery. The wealthy had other options. As early as 2,000 to 3,000 BC, wealthy and powerful people retreated from the stench and crowds of the cities to the fresher air of the nearby countryside, where they built beautiful country homes and estates. In 1908, Henry Ford leveled the playing field with the Model T, the first mass-produced affordable automobile. In less than a generation, the automobile radically impacted not only city design, but offered a means for the middle class to ditch their tiny walk-up apartments for their very own, if heavily mortgaged, mini country estates. Country life became attainable to not just the envied rich, but the masses. We thought that when we put everyone in a car and they drove away, that this would solve all of our problems. And it actually worked reasonably well when only 10% of the population was doing it. After World War II, battle-weary veterans sought happy ever afters with their new brides and families in what was advertised as safe, healthy, affordable suburban communities. Not wanting to repeat the health hazards of city life and having a clean slate of raw land, zoning commissions were created to prevent the building of residential areas next to, say, a slaughterhouse. Industrial, manufacturing, office, and retail were isolated from each other and the residential areas, with the car as the principal method of transportation between the segregated life zones.
Like so many people these days, we live in the suburbs, and Dave needs the car every day for business. When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't get out to see my friends, couldn't take part in PTA activities. I couldn't even shop when I wanted to. I had to wait till Thursday night after Dave brought the car home. But that's all changed now. 3 weeks ago, we bought another Ford. Isn't it stunning? Dave has it all to himself. And I now have the ranch wagon all to myself. It's a whole new way of life.
Thus, sprawl was born, and with it grew a whole myriad of problems that few had anticipated.
It's harder to know where home is in a big, sprawling area. We live our lives in very large triangles, with one point being where we sleep, and one point being where we shop, and one point being where we work. And when we lived in villages, the distance between those 3 points was really small. But now that many of us live in very large metropolitan areas, the distance between where we sleep and where we work, or where we sleep and where we shop, might be 30, 40, 50, 60 miles. And that means it's not quite clear where home is.
Two leading experts on the causes and negative effects of suburban sprawl, who also develop and promote solutions to correct these failings, are themselves architects and collaborators. They are Ellen Dunham-Jones, director of the architecture program at Georgia Tech, and June Williamson, professor of architecture at the City College of New York.
Suburbia is dependent on a model of the cheapest housing being on the cheapest land that's always the furthest out. And so we've had a model for the last 50 years of drive till you qualify affordability that really assumes that my cheapest housing unfortunately also comes with the longest commute. I am actually really fascinated by the topic of how might we better measure happiness. Surveys show a steady decline in happiness from the 50s to the present. That's a period when we've also seen affluence and wealth consistently going up. And in particular, there's a Cornell economist who has suggested that buying the big house out in the suburbs makes us happy at first, but once you get used to it, it doesn't accrue the same level of happiness to you. But that your daily commute reminds you every day of how unhappy you are.
It forces you to get behind the wheel for everything you need to do throughout a day. You find yourself in drive-through lines and you find yourself stuck in traffic. Imagine the average person who spends about an hour each way in traffic in their car. That's 2 hours a day, 10 a week, 40 a month. That's 40 hours that you don't have to be healthy, to spend time with friends and family. That's hours and dollars and memories and quality of life that's being taken from you in some ways.
And every year, the amount of time that it takes people to get back and forth to work gets longer and longer and longer. Sitting in a car is not healthy for us. Driving in traffic is not healthy for us. For the most part, today's environmental laws and health standards make it unnecessary to separate the workplace, retail, and residential areas of a suburban community. Yet, these zoning laws continue. In fact, the separate zone society itself now contributes to poor health. Little or no provisions were made for diversity of income, life needs, or age. Single-family dwellings were the only option. There were no apartments or condominiums that might better suit the needs of young singles, professional working couples without children, or the elderly who could no longer maintain or afford homes or had lost the ability to drive. And one of the things we absolutely need to do is change that book, sometimes called the general plan or the master plan. That needs to be a book that embraces health and tells people how to design healthy places, not simply how to move people in cars most rapidly.
Suburbia has largely been sold on it's the healthy choice, especially for raising families. And it's great for little kids. But once you're a teenager, or once you're elderly and can no longer drive, suburbia can actually be extremely isolating. AARP, I know, came out with a study that shows that if you're an American male and you get to age 65, you are likely to outlive your ability to drive by 8 years, and a woman by 10 years.
What you don't want to have happen is having a whole bunch of older adults locked in their houses not being able to go places. You want them to be able to be very functional and live their lives.
And this is almost heartbreaking, is people that live in isolated places that totally require cars all the time. And now because of disability, maybe vision problems, maybe even memory problems, they're not able to drive any longer. And this is a recipe for isolation and depression. It's tough on women, it's really tough on men. We see this over and over again, this loss of the ability to be autonomous actually raises the risk of depression and even suicide in elderly people. And yet, when you think about it, for thousands of years, old folks aged in the community where they lived and they could still meet their needs. They still could walk down and see their old friends. They still could socialize and have a cup of coffee with friends the way we used to build communities. But now, unless someone comes and picks you up in a little bus to take you to a mall somewhere, you can sit in your house all alone if you're elderly.
When we go hang out, we have to get permission from our parents first, and then we have to figure out whose parent is taking us, because we have other siblings that have to do things too, so it makes it difficult for us to get places.
I find myself sitting at home with my friends, and we're always saying, like, so what should we go do? There's like the mall or the movies, but after doing that a lot, like, it gets old and you want something new to do. And then we're like, okay, well, do we have a ride? And we have to figure out a ride, and then we ask our parents and they're busy or something and they can't take us. So then we're like, okay, well, I guess we can't go. We have to figure something out on our own at home to do. So there's like not much.
We build subdivisions that isolate children miles from where their friends live. And imagine being 16 years old and your social outlet is the mall or it's school, and you need to ask for a ride every time you want to go to either one of them.
I feel lonely, because when I sit at home bored and then I'm just staring at my wall, I feel like I'm just in this small box and I can't get out. I feel like I keep running into walls every 5 seconds because I can't do anything. It's not a good feeling.
As a pediatrician, I'm very concerned that the suburban isolation that Aisha describes increases depression, both in teens and in the elderly. Depression is serious. At its worst, it can even lead to suicide, currently the 3rd highest cause of death in older teens. Our recent census shows that 65% of suburban households have no children, and in the next 15 years, that portion could become 80%. Still, most of suburbia is zoned for single-family dwellings only.
For some of those neighborhoods that are zoned single-family only would be a simple zoning change to allow accessory dwelling units or detached accessory dwelling units, which could allow a couple or a single on a fixed income living in a house to rent out part of their home to a young single person in need of affordable housing.
One theory of retrofitting suburbs is to find a way to make them into small towns or urban communities by creating town centers or destinations for community interaction and commerce within the suburb. Abandoned shopping centers, or dead malls, offer cheap and available real estate for this experimentation.
When malls were first being built in the 70s, and they were out on the edge, and they were happy to be out on the edge, and downtown was way over here, and they're looking at Prairie or whatever, out at the other side. Very auto-dependent, but gas was cheap. They loved it. Then they were leapfrogged. Then they were leapfrogged again. And each new mall that came along took away market share. But ironically, this process of leapfrogging now means that those dead or dying malls actually have a relatively central position in their metropolis.
One such gigantic dead mall was the Villa Italia in Lakewood, Colorado, an inner-ring suburb of Denver.
Well, that's a really interesting project. The city of Lakewood was very concerned about the loss, and the sort of default option would be to redevelop it as what's called a big box power center, which has happened to other regional malls that have closed, which would mean getting in Home Depot, Walmart, that set of uses, still very car dependent. But instead, they partnered with a developer and came up with a different vision.
What impresses me about Villa Italia and turning it into the new urbanist community of Bel Mar is it took people really deciding what we were going to be, because there are a lot of options what that could have become, and to decide we're going to create a heart for our community was an important one, and they were getting pressure to do something different. By the time it's completed, Bel Mar's 22 blocks will contain over 1 million square feet of